Hello everyone, welcome to these series of videos of head and neck anatomy practicals produced by Faculty of Dentistry, University of Khartoum. This is Wathir Al-Fatih Idris, a teaching assistant of anatomy at Basic Medical Sciences, Faculty of Dentistry, University of Khartoum. Today's session is going to be about the face. We'll discuss various muscles of facial expression, after which we'll follow this by talking about the innervation of the face, including the cutaneous or the sensory and the motor innervation. Following is the blood supply of the face and venous drainage, and finally we'll terminate this session by talking about the parotid gland with its various components and structures passing through. So let's start. The face is that part of the front of the head that extends from the tragus of one ear to that of the other, and from the normal hairline to the inferior border, or where it ought to be, to the inferior border of the mandible. This station is concerned about the muscles of facial expression. These muscles are unique in that they have got only a single bony attachment, and the other attachment is to the facial skin. The other criteria is that they are not clothed or plastered down to the bone by any means of the fascia. These two anatomical facts make its dissection a difficult matter, and the muscles usually do not appear clearly. Functionally, those muscles, or the muscles of facial expression, are arranged into two groups, a dilator and a sphincter group around the facial orifice, that is to say, the eyelids, the nostrils, and the lips or the mouth. The muscles of the eyelids include the dilator group is formed of the levator palpebrae superioris. This muscle originates within the orbit from the apex, from its apex and from the lesser wing of the sphenoid bone, and then it passes forward along the roof of the orbit, and it becomes replaced by an aponeurosis. This aponeurosis is inserted here in front of the superior tarsal plate. And the other group that the other muscle that belongs to this dilator group is the frontal belly of occipital frontalis. This muscle is going to be discussed in the next session together with the skull. The sphincter process, or the sphincter mechanism of the eyelids, is made by this muscle. This is known as the orbicularis oculi, which is composed of three parts: a deep part, which is known as the lacrimal part, that originates from the lacrimal sac and the posterior lacrimal crest. And this part blends with the superficial part, the palpebral part, which is confined only to the eyelid. So it has got a lacrimal part that originates from the lacrimal sac and the posterior lacrimal crest, and blends laterally with the palpebral part that is confined only to the upper and the lower eyelids. And the third, or the largest part, is known as the orbital part. This orbital part forms the bulk of the muscle and extends beyond the orbital margin into the face. This part originates from here, the nasal part of the frontal bone, the frontal process, the maxilla, and the anterior lacrimal crest, and then its fibers stand forming a series of concentric whorls or circles around the orbit. That's all about the muscles of the eyelids. Muscles of the nostrils include this muscle. This is known as the nasalis muscle. The nasalis muscle has got two parts: a transverse part and a transverse and alar part. It originates from the maxilla, and as I've said, that its fibers are arranged into a transverse part that forms a bridge or aponeurosis over the nasal bridge with its fellow of the opposite side, and an alar part. This is the alar part that is inserted into the side of the ala of the nose. Each part performs a different function. The sphincter mechanism is made by the transverse part, whereas the dilator is made by the alar part here, assisted by a muscle that is known as the depressor septi. This muscle originates here from the maxilla, just above the central incisors, and is inserted into the nasal septum. And also it is assisted by the levator labii superioris alekinesi. This muscle here is known as the levator labii superioris alekinesi, that originates here from the frontal process of the maxilla, and it descends downward to be inserted into the side of the nose, or the ala of the nose, as well as the upper lip. It elevates both the upper lip and the side of the nose. So the compressor or the sphincter is made by the transverse part of nasalis, while the dilator is made by this alar part, assisted by two muscles, the depressor septi and the levator labii superioris alekinesi. Muscles. Finally, we're going to move to talk about muscles around the mouth. The sphincter is this part, and this is known as the orbicularis oris, that is composed of intrinsic fibers proper to itself and also extrinsic fibers that are contributed and added to form the dilator group, and mostly from the buccinator muscle. The buccinator originates above the molars here. This is the buccinator muscle. It originates above the, or opposite the molars, from both the maxilla and the mandible. From the maxilla it originates horizontally opposite the molars or above them, and from the mandible it originates opposite the molars, just below them, from the oblique line of the mandible. And also it originates between the maxilla and the mandible from the pterygomandibular raphe that stretches between the pterygoid hamidus above and downwards to the retromolar area of the mandible. The fibers of the buccinator converge towards the corner of the mouth here into a structure that is known as the modulus. The modulus itself is a knot of muscle fibers that are surrounded by fibrous connective tissue. So the muscle fibers of the buccinator converge towards the modulus. The uppermost fibers pass straight onto the upper lip, while the lowermost fibers pass directly into the lower lip. The fibers that constitute the middle of the muscle, that is to say the fibers that originate from the pterygomandibular raphe, decussate here, so that the lower of these fibers pass upward into the upper lip, and the upper of these middle fibers pass downwards into the lower lip. That's about the sphincter group. The dilator group include the rest of the facial muscles, these muscles radiating from the orbicularis oris like the spokes of four wheels. These are the levator labii superioris. Okay, this is the levator labii superioris, which originate from that originates from the inferior orbital margin into the passing downwards into the upper eye, into the upper lip, which it elevates. And also it includes the levator labii superioris alekinesi, which I've said that it originates from the frontal process of the maxilla and extends downward to be inserted into the ala of the nose as well as the upper lip. It also includes the levator anguli oris, which originates from the canine fossa and extends downwards into the modulus here. Also include the zygomaticus minor and zygomaticus major muscles. This is the zygomaticus minor, this is the zygomaticus major. The zygomaticus minor originates from the zygomatico maxillary fissure and extends downward into the modulus, while the zygomaticus major here originates from the front of the zygomatic bone and descends downward also into the modulus. The rhizorius is muscle fibers that, or is another muscle that originates here from the parotid fascia and passes medially into the modulus. It's not found here in this diagram. The depressor labii inferioris, it originates from the mandible, just in front of the mental foramen, and passes upwards into the mandible. This deeper muscle is the levator labii inferioris. It passes upwards to be inserted into the modulus, and more superficially is this muscle which is known as the depressor anguli oris. It originates from the front of the mandible, front of the body of the mandible, below the mental foramen, and passes upwards also into the modulus. Here, these muscle fibers belong to the mentalis that originates from the anterior midline of the mandible and passes downward to be inserted into the skin of the chin. Other facial muscles that cannot be seen here in this diagram include the platysma, which originates from the fascia of the parted, the fascia over the pectoralis major and the deltoid muscles, to be inserted into the lower border of the mandible, and some of the fibers extend onto the face. The other one is the procerus, which originates here from the nasal bones and the nasal cartilage and pass upwards to be inserted into the skin of the lower forehead. So, in order to revise the dilator part, this is the levator labii superioris alekinesi, levator labii superioris. This is the levator anguli oris. This is the zygomaticus minor, zygomaticus major muscle. Inferiorly here we have the depressor anguli oris, depressor labii inferioris, and mentalis muscle. That's all for the muscles of facial expression. Now we're going to discuss the blood supply of the face in the next station. Here in this cadaver, we're going to see what can be seen of the facial muscles. Here is the frontalis, or the frontal belly of occipitalis frontalis muscle. This is the orbicularis oculi. The fibers of orbicularis oculi form a concentric layers around the eyelids. Here we can see the palpebral part of orbicularis oculi. On the left side here, we can see the levator labii superioris alekinesi. Lateral to it is the levator labii superioris passing downwards into the upper lip. We can also see this muscle, this small muscle, which is known as zygomaticus minor, and we can also see zygomaticus major. Here is the site of the modulus, where the dilator muscles insert, and the buccinator also forms a chiasma. This is the depressor anguli oris, and here is the depressor labii inferioris. This is the site of mentalis muscle. This is all what we can see of the facial muscles in this specimen. So let's move to the next station. Now this station shows the arterial supply of the face. The face is supplied primarily by the facial artery. The facial artery, after it emerges from the external carotid arteries, has been noted in the carotid triangle, or the station or the section that discusses the anterior triangle of the neck. It originates from the external carotid artery, and then it passes forward and medially. It hooks over the top of the submandibular gland. Then it assumes an S-shaped bend around the inferior border of the mandible. This is the S-shaped bend around the inferior border of the mandible in order to reach the face just in front of the anterior margin of the masseter muscle. It pursues a tortuous course accompanied by the facial vein posterior to it, and lying on the buccinator muscle first, and then passes deep to the dilator group of muscles in order to reach the medial canthus of the eye here. Each facial artery gives a superior labial and inferior labial artery that travel medially into the lips of the opposites and anastomosis of its fellow of the opposite side. The superior labial artery gives a septal branch, or a septal artery that passes upwards to supply the nasal septum. Other sources of the blood supply or source of blood supply other than the facial artery include the transverse facial artery. This transverse facial artery comes off the superficial temporal artery to supply the side of the face. Also, the supraorbital and the supratrochlear branches from the ophthalmic artery within the orbit contribute to the supply of the forehead, while the dorsal nasal branch supplies the face over the root of the nose. Now talking about the venous drainage of the face. Blood is drained primarily from the face by means of the facial vein that commences here at the medial canthus of the eye as the angular vein. It descends downward, posterior to the facial artery, assuming a straight course downwards deep to the dilator muscles and on the buccinator muscle. While the venous drainage from the temporal region is carried by the superficial temporal vein, it descends downward and is joined within the parotid gland by the maxillary vein from the infratemporal fossa. In order to form this vein, short vein, and this is known as the retromandibular vein. As soon as it exits the parotid gland or within the parotid gland, it divides into two divisions, an anterior division and a posterior one. The anterior division of the retromandibular vein continues downward and it joins the facial vein in order to form the common facial vein. This common facial vein is sometimes joined by the lingual vein and by the superior thyroid vein in some instances, and it drains into the interna jugular vein within the carotid sheath. While the posterior division of the retromandibular vein joins the posterior orbicular vein behind the ear from the skull and descend downward to form the externa jugular vein. That this vein descends downward on the surface of the sternocleidomastoid muscle, and then it pierces the deep fascia at the inferior part of the posterior cervical triangle to drain into the subclavian vein here. This diagram shows the nerve supply, the cutaneous innervation of the face. The sensory innervation is conveyed from the face by the several branches of the ophthalmic, maxillary, and mandibular divisions of the trigeminal nerve. The ophthalmic division has 5 facial cutaneous branches. These are the lacrimal nerve. This lacrimal nerve here supplies the lateral part of the upper eyelid. The supraorbital nerve. This is the supraorbital nerve here. It supplies the forehead as well as the scalp as far backwards as the vertex. While the supratrochlear nerve supplies the medial part of the upper eyelid, and also it supplies the middle part of the forehead as far upward as the normal hairline. The infratrochlear nerve supplies the most medial parts of the upper and lower eyelids, and also it supplies the bridge of the nose. Finally, the external nasal nerve. This is the external nasal nerve, the terminal branch from the ophthalmic nerve. It supplies the skin overlying the nose as far downward as the tip. Okay, so the cutaneous branches from the ophthalmic division of the trigeminal nerve onto the face are the supratrochlear, supraorbital, the lacrimal, infratrochlear, and the external nasal nerves. While the maxillary division has got only 3 cutaneous branches to the face, the infraorbital nerve, this is the infraorbital nerve that accompanies the infraorbital vessels and exits into the face through the infraorbital foramen. It soon divides into tuft of branches that supply the skin overlying the lower eyelid, the side of the nose, as well as the upper lip. The second branch from the maxillary nerve is the zygomaticofacial nerve that exits through the zygomaticofacial foramen on the anterior surface of the zygomatic bone. It supplies the overlying skin. The third one is known as the zygomaticotemporal, that originates or exits through the zygomaticotemporal foramen in the posterior surface of the zygomatic bone and ascends upwards to supply a small area of the temporal region. So the three branches from the maxillary nerve are the infraorbital, the zygomaticofacial, and zygomaticotemporal branches. While the mandibular division of the trigeminal nerve contributes to the cutaneous innervation of the face by means of three branches. These are the orbiculotemporal nerve. This is the orbiculotemporal nerve that runs just in front of the ear and ascends upwards. The second one is the long buccal nerve, and the third one here is the mental nerve. Orbiculotemporal, buccal, and the mental nerves will be discussed in the next section, next station, together with the mandibular division of the trigeminal nerve. This is for the cutaneous innervation of the face. While the motor supply is provided by the facial nerve, it will be discussed in the following station. Here we can see the facial artery originating from the external carotid artery. It passes deep to the submandibular gland, and then it forms an S-shaped bend around the inferior border of the mandible to reach the face just in front of the masseter muscle. It pursues a tortuous course. It passes upwards deep to the dilator muscles and on the buccinator muscle. It gives branches of supply to the upper and the lower lips. These are the superior and inferior labia. The inferior labia cannot be seen here. The superior labial artery, and then it passes upwards deep to the muscles, reaching the medial corner of the eye or the medial canthus, and also it gives branches of supply to the side of the nose. Posterior to the facial artery, we can see the facial nerve. The facial vein, here is the facial vein, has got a straight course posterior to the artery. It descends downwards, crossing just at the anterior border of the masseter muscle. It communicates or meets with the anterior division of the retromandibular vein as it appears below the parotid gland to form the common facial vein. The common facial vein ultimately terminates by uniting or by draining into the internal jugular vein. This is the last station using this flashcard, which shows the parotid gland. Here, this is the parotid gland. It is the largest of the major salivary glands that is composed mainly of severus acini and contributes to about 35% of salivary secretion. The gland lies behind or posterior to the mandible, in front of the ear or the external acoustic meatus, with some overlap anteriorly on the masseter and posteriorly onto the mastoid process and the sternocleidomastoid muscle. It extends from the zygomatic arch superiorly to the upper part of the neck, inferiorly overlapping the posterior belly of digastric muscle here and the sternocleidomastoid muscle partially. The gland is covered by its own capsule derived from the investing layer of deep cervical fascia. It's known as the parotid capsule or the parotid fascia. The gland in cross-section is wedge-shaped with lateral surface, posterior medial and anterior medial surfaces. The parotid duct, this is the green structure here, emerges from the anterior medial surface and extends beyond the anterior border or the anterior margin onto the masseter. Then it pierces the buccinator muscle here, opposite the maxillary third molar, and runs for a short distance in the submucosa, and finally it opens into the oral cavity opposite the maxillary second molar. The fascia nerve, the retromandibular vein, and the terminal part of the external carotid artery run within the gland substance in different planes. The most superficial is the facial vein, is the facial nerve. It exits the skull through the stylomastoid foramen, and then it gives a muscular and a posterior auricular branch, after which it enters the posterior medial surface of the parotid gland. There it divides into two trunks, or two divisions. These are known as the temporofacial and cervicofacial divisions within the gland. They divide, reunite, and then divide again, forming plexiform arrangement, and then they give rise to five terminal branches into the face that are distributed as follows. The zygomatic branches emerge from the upper border or from the upper pole of the gland, ascends upwards. It supplies the auricularis anterior as well as part of the frontal belly of occipital frontalis muscle. Here, this is the temporal branch. It supplies the auricularis anterior muscle as well as part of the frontal belly of occipital frontalis muscle. The zygomatic branches emerge from the uppermost aspect of the anterior border of the parotid gland, and it supplies primarily the orbicularis oculi muscle with some innervation to the zygomaticus major and minor muscles here. The buccal branches emerge also from the anterior aspect of the gland. They are usually double, one above and one below the parotid duct. These branches supply the muscles of the nose as well as the muscles of the upper lip here, including the buccinator itself. The fourth branch is the marginal mandibular branch. This branch originates from the anterior border of the parotid gland. It follows the inferior border of the mandible, or sometimes just below it, and then it crosses the mandible on the top of the facial vessels to supply the muscles of the lower lip. The fifth and the final branch emerges from the lower pole of the gland and descends downwards into the upper part of the neck in order to supply the platysma. So these are the terminal branches of the facial nerve. In order to remind you of them, these are the temporal branches that supply auricularis anterior and frontal belly of occipital frontalis, the zygomatic branches that supply orbicularis oculi and zygomaticus muscles, the buccal branches which supply muscles of the upper lip and the nose, the marginal mandibular supplies muscles of the lower lip, and finally the cervical branches which supply the platysma. The retromandibular vein lies at a deeper level, deep to the plane of the facial nerve within the gland, and where it divides into anterior and posterior divisions. Finally, the external carotid artery is the deepest within the gland, divides into superficial temporal and maxillary arteries. Both emerge from the gland through the anterior medial surface. The superficial temporal vessels pass upwards in the temple, while the maxillary passes forward and deep to the mandibular neck into the infratemporal fossa. That's all about the parotid gland in this flashcard. Now we're going to move into the cadaver to see the parotid gland. Here we can see the parotid gland. It's not clearly visible, however, this is the location of the parotid. This is the parotid gland. It is located behind the ramus of the mandible and in front of the ear, with some extension posteriorly. Extending from the anterior border of the parotid gland is this structure. This is the parotid duct or Stensen's duct. It passes forward in front or on the surface of the masseter muscle, and then it penetrates the buccinator muscle opposite the third maxillary molar. Yes. Extending From the borders, from beneath the borders of the parotid gland are the terminal branches of the facial nerve. This is the temporal branch of the facial nerve passing upwards to supply the frontal belly, as well as gives also a branch to supply auricularis anterior muscle here. Here is the zygomatic branch of the facial nerve passing upwards and medially to supply orbicularis oculi muscle, and more below, close to the parotid duct, are the buccal branches of the facial nerve. These are the buccal branches. They are heading towards the supply of the dilator muscles, especially those of the upper lip. Okay. This slender nerve is the marginal mandibular branch of the facial nerve, passing forward in order to supply the muscles of the lower lip. And the terminal branch, or the fifth branch, originates from the lower pole of the parotid gland. Is not seen in this specimen because it has been removed with the dissection of the neck. It has been removed with the platysma. So this is the temporal, this is the zygomatic, these are the buccal branches, and this is the marginal mandibular branch of the facial nerve. Also extending from the upper pole of the parotid gland, more posterior to the zygomatic branches, are the superficial temporal vessels. This is the superficial temporal artery and the accompanying superficial temporal vein. That's all about the parotid gland in this station. Now, our practice has come to an end. See you next week, inshallah.